Intermezzo with puddings. The third of the philosophers of this Platonic cycle is Elizabeth Carter. Unlike Sydenham's disastrous edition of Plato, Elizabeth Carter's translation of the works of the Stoic Epictetus was a great financial success. Elizabeth Carter, 1717 to 1809, was the daughter of Nicholas Carter, perpetual curate of Deal, Kent. At the age of 16, she was publishing poetry in the Gentleman's Magazine, and by the late 1730s was in London. She met Thomas Wright, later to work as architect at Shugborough, responsible for the original Shepherd's Monument and other things there, at the house of scientist and influential Freemason Dr. Desaguliers. Wright became a very close friend and correspondent, but their letters vanished in the 19th century. She also met the young Samuel Johnson, who was a great enemy of James Harris. He didn't hold with this Platonic nonsense at all. That doesn't mean to say he was a bad man. Johnson was entranced by this witty and startlingly learned woman. He later said that his old friend Mrs. Carter could make a pudding as well as translate Epictetus. Mrs. is an honorary title. She was never married. And in her extremely interesting letters, she admits that she did have a habit of putting too much alcohol in her puddings. Her poetry reveals that she had a deep knowledge of Plato. Now you have to realise this is a young woman in her 20s in 1730s and 1740s London. With Plato, soar on contemplation's wing, and trace perfection to the eternal spring. Observe the vital emanations flow that animate each fair degree below. Her most famous poem, Ode to Wisdom, 1746. From envy, hurry, noise and strife, the dull impertinence of life, in thy retreat I rest, pursue thee to the peaceful groves where Plato's sacred spirit roves, in all thy graces dressed. This poem, Ode to Wisdom, was first published anonymously in the Gentleman's Magazine, but it became more famous when it was included without permission in Samuel Richardson's novel Clarissa in 1748, where it plays the part of a poem by the novel's heroine, and it appears with a musical setting. Carter was astonished. She wrote to her friend Catherine Talbot, I immediately wrote a twincation to Mr. Richardson about it, to which I received so civil an answer I knew not how to be angry with him. The only two uses of the word twincation I can find are both from Elizabeth Carter. But this raised Carter's profile. It's significant that Samuel Richardson had recognised the unusual Platonic thinking of the poem's author. He referred to her as a female Norris, Norris being the 17th century Salisbury Platonist and opponent of John Locke, John Norris. Carter's poems were collected as poems on several occasions and published in 1762 with a dedication to Lord Bath and an introductory poem by Lord Lyttelton. Work on her translation of Epictetus took several years, involving consultation with James Harris, but it proved an inspired idea. The Stoic philosophy caught the mood of the time more than the Platonism of Harris and Sydenham. Carter's Epictetus was the first important classical translation by a woman. It was published in 1758. Thomas Anson's copy, I'm glad to say, is still in the library at Shugborough. It sold enough to give Carter an income and make her one of the first women writers to make a living by her work. It has never gone out of print. Elizabeth Carter became one of the leading figures in the blue stocking cycle led by Mrs. Montague. These are the ladies of the blue stockings as the muses, and Carter is the far left one. These intellectual women held literary conversazioni. The original wearer of blue stockings, and a rare man at the meetings, was Benjamin Stillingfleet. He was too poor to afford silk stockings. His blue worsted inspired the group's familiar name. Stillingfleet, who I haven't got time to tell you much about today, was a botanist, musician, librettist, and unsung influence on the natural style of English garden. He was another close friend of Thomas Anson, who gave him an annuity of £100 in his will. Unfortunately, Stillingfleet died before he could enjoy it. And so we're seeing that these people, as you will have noticed, even though it may have just become slightly confusing to you, all these names, they make a very small group of people who are all connected in all sorts of ways with Thomas Anson and Lord Lyttelton as patrons, and then Harris and Sydenham as philosophers, and Stillingfleet and the artist James Athenian Stewart. They all knew each other, they all interlink, and they support each other. There was a breakfast and concert at Thomas Anson's New London house in 1769, in honour of Mrs. Montague of the Bluestockings. Elizabeth Carter and James Harris were certainly there, and I'm sure Lord Lyttelton, Stillingfleet and Stewart, the architect, would have been there. I can't answer for Floyer Sydenham. But it's fascinating to be able to pinpoint at least one occasion when most, if not all, the principal players of this forgotten revolution were all under one roof, admiring the latest designs inspired by Greece. Epilogue. There's an evolution of attitudes to the Arcadian ideal during the 18th century. This is a great oversimplification, but I think it makes some sense. The gardens of William Kent, created in the 1730s, Stowe and Rasham, are an Arcadian dream, a theatrical imitation of nature. This is not to say they don't have serious philosophical meaning within them. But by the time of the Greek revival in the mid-century, fashions had changed. James Harris passed on an anecdote told to him by George Lyttelton. He wrote that the Duchess of Marlborough asked Vanbrugh to design a garden for Blenheim. Vanbrugh refused and said, "For a garden truly elegant, you must apply to the best painters of landscape." And Harris comments that Vanbrugh had predicted a taste that would be developed by Kent and completed by Capability Brown, who worked at Blenheim from 1764. And this is the move towards gardens that are more and more natural. The landscapes of Capability Brown aimed to appear natural, with carefully placed trees and curving streams. But soon, even Brown's landscapes would seem artificial. These were nature improved with manicured lawns. The satirist Richard Owen Cambridge, who was a friend both of Thomas Anson and James Harris, quipped that he hoped to die before Brown so he could see heaven before it was improved. There was a place for the idealized imitation of nature as a setting for one's country house. But the Platonic spirit in the 18th century inspired an enthusiasm to find truth in nature itself, unimproved. Even as early as the 1750s, Thomas Anson, George Lyttelton and Benjamin Stillingfleet had travelled to Wales long before the unspoiled landscapes would become domesticated as the picturesque. Richard Owen Cambridge even tried to buy Piercefield, the romantic park and viewpoint for Tintern Abbey, which 20 years or so later was the classic place to sit and do one's watercolours. By the end of the century, the Romantic poets would be seeking truth in the wildernesses of the Lake District. This evolving attitude is inspired by the search for truth within nature, guided by virtue. But truth and reason can never be separated from imagination, which, we have heard, unites nature with the forms archetypal, as Sydenham calls them in his poem Truth. That's the view from Piercefield down towards Tintern Abbey, from a later period of romantic, picturesque travellers. One of the intriguing ideas within Sydenham's unsatisfactory epic is the thought that the world of imagination can be united with this world. He writes, "The mighty magic of the muse can draw down from the sky this fancy land of imagination itself, and can seat it where she pleases, like Latona's Isle, the floating Delos. Places, whether artificial gardens or natural landscapes, can have stories or mythological meaning drawn into them by the muses." So let's allow a spark of fancy to enter after so much history and philosophy. I like to think that Shugborough, where this talk began, is such a place. The garden and follies, subject to changing fashions, only decorate what is already there in that sweet vale at the confluence of the rivers Sow and Trent. The first of Sydenham's Plato dialogues, Io, dedicated to Lord Lyttelton, 1759, the same time as Lyttelton's Hagley Temple was built, is an amusing, sometimes funny discussion about inspiration, the divine spark which comes from the muses. So Plato says, as translated by Sydenham, "For they, the poets, assure us that out of certain gardens and flowery vales belonging to the muses, from fountains flowing there with honey, gathering the sweetness of their songs, they bring it to us like the bees, and in the same manner withal, flying. Nor do they tell us any untruth, for a poet is a thing light and volatile and sacred, nor is he able to write poetry till the muse entering into him, he is transported out of himself and has no longer the command of his understanding." Shugborough is just such a vale of the muses, where all the harmonies of Sydenham's sirens are tuned for consonance in one perfect melody. Thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. You have transported us with that rich and fascinating talk. We'll all draw a breath now. We're open for questions, I think. Yes.
Yes. So I try you first, and then you. Is that right? Yes.
I was rather intrigued because you said your talk was described, it saying that Thomas Taylor had appropriated Sydenham's work. Is that too strong a term, do you think?
Well, it is a very strong term, but I think I put that because Taylor does credit Sydenham, and he wrote a panegyric to Sydenham.
Yes.
But because it was absorbed into Taylor, Sydenham as himself then gets forgotten. And I think that is the tragedy, because what is extraordinarily common understanding is that Taylor sparked this revival of the Platonic philosophy, which then influenced the Romantic poets. But when you look at Sydenham and James Harris, you can see that in fact there is this much smaller flowering of the Platonism that is having an influence much before Taylor. And in the same way that you can find a lot of the influences in the Romantic poets, it's actually happening in earlier poets. So I'm just standing up for Sydenham, who was obviously slightly bonkers, but he was a bit of a bonkers visionary. And I think the 18th century had its own angle on all this, which inspired them in a slightly different way. And I'm just trying to bring a bit more of that to light. But I'm certainly not undervaluing the effect of Taylor in the 19th century.
So it wasn't really Taylor's fault, it's just history has adopted Taylor as the great...
exactly, I'm not blaming Taylor for anything. We wouldn't have heard Sydenham at all.
I'm so glad.
Exactly.
Thank you.
Hello. You're next, and then you.
No, just a question really about you saying about how the 18th century viewed things, and you mentioned right at the end about some of the texts being funny.
Yes.
And amusing. I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that, because I think sometimes you sort of think, gosh, do they all walk around sort of just going on about philosophy, or did they actually enjoy these places? And
they
how
really
did that
enjoy
work?
them. I think humour is enormously important, and it's an underestimated importance in Platonic philosophy. And Sydenham actually says about the humour of Plato's dialogues, and in one of them, it might be Io, he said that this should be performed by some good comedians. And he sees comedy all the way through. And Lord Shaftesbury, who inspired Taylor and Harris and Sydenham, was very much a person who argued for the value of raillery and comedy. And some of the dialogues are funny, and the letters about Sydenham by their friends are also very funny. Yes.
That's a very interesting point. Right at the beginning, you said that, and I've come to this conclusion, if you like, natural Platonists are usually, they're not joiners necessarily, they're often artists. I discovered not long ago that Pope, his poetry, and of course he was incredibly funny, that he seemed to certainly know about these ideas, and obviously a lot of his colleagues and friends were interested in these ideas. That was very inspiring. I found that I really like that. Oh, can I just that lovely Poussin painting? If you haven't got it now, I'd like to, if you know the title of it, because.
Well, the one that was the landscape.
The one you showed. It wasn't Poussin.
There's the Eton Arcadia with the shepherds.
No,
there's a landscape.
It's the gathering of the ashes of Phocion.
Yeah,
with that
I think it's in Liverpool.
It's at the Walker Art Gallery.
Yes.
It's one of the best landscapes.
It's stunning. I'll get the title later.
Well, I think you're right. I'm interested you mentioned Pope, but I don't know much about Pope. Because I tend to be... My elastic is stretched the further I go back. When I get into Pope, it's been stretched a long way. See, it's going backwards. I tend to think more of the second half of the 18th century, but I think you're absolutely right that Pope's philosophical interest has not really been explored very much, and I think it's starting to appear. And again, it's buried within the comedy. But it doesn't mean to say he didn't have a really serious understanding of this. And I think the more we look at this, the more it comes out. Because as I'm sort of a musician, my hero is Haydn. And Haydn's great thing was comedy. But he was thought of as a philosophical musician because of that. And it's all of the comedy, and it directly derives from Lord Shaftesbury, is the idea that comedy embraces conflicting ideas, it's tolerant. And it's the Shakespearean idea of comedy, and that's enormously important. It's the critical thing in the development of the classical musical style in the second half of the 18th century.
Does magic come into Sydenham's work in any way?
I'm so glad somebody asked me that. I can't actually answer it honestly, but when you start looking at this, you can't help thinking, do they see these landscapes as purely philosophical, or is there some theurgic, magical intention, initiatory intention in the landscape? And I have very carefully only told you actual facts and quotations from material that is at hand. But the more I look into it, the more I feel you can't really escape having what we might say a magical idea in this landscape as well. And what I'm doing now is thinking, can you justify that? And the thing which is really, I'm going into uncharted territory for me, but other people know a lot more about this, is the influence of Proclus. And I don't really know much about these late Platonic philosophers, but Sydenham says Proclus is the greatest of the Alexandrian philosophers. And the critical thing I believe to be the case with Proclus is that there's far more emphasis on the material world as the way towards truth. Plotinus, who is very popular and Sydenham is also influenced by, tends to be seen as escaping material things and lifting yourself up to higher truths. But Proclus has much more emphasis on that, and also Proclus justifies mythology, and he has a complicated system in which all the classical gods have their place as conveying truth to you. And if you were reading that in the 18th century and going to the opera and all that kind of thing, and building your temples with all your statues, you would not just think this is a pretty statue. You couldn't help thinking, to a philosopher I like, this is actually leading me towards truth. So yes, I think that's something we need to explore.
You mentioned the quote about consonants and making the perfect melody. Is that related to gematria and maybe sacred geometry? Is there a sort of influence there that, say, these landscapes were set out with sacred proportions, and the consonants, I think in Greek, would have a specific numerical meaning, wouldn't they?
It absolutely would. But again, I can only go by what material I've got in hand. So yes, so the question here is that when in that section, which I just like because I like musical symbolism, about the muses being the sirens who all have their own harmonies, but together they make the complete consonance, which is Plato's Timaeus and the myth of and other things. He's put it all together. It is a mathematical thing. It's about the mathematical proportions of harmony. And in somewhere else in Truth, he does have a section about the quadrivium. You'll be pleased to know, Leon, where he does talk about music and geometry and what the other two are. And so he does actually talk about that. So he's seeing that as knowledge and truth through all those things which have geometry at the heart of them. So yes, that is there, and I can't see you can get far from that when you're talking about classical buildings and architecture. So again, I am suggesting wonderful areas for other people to explore.
We can see these landscapes as like sacred theatre, can't we?
Yes.
Yes, you're going on a soul journey through them.
I think they do, and I think I've always been sceptical of the idea of an 18th century landscape like Chopra being an initiatory theatrical journey, but I'm getting less sceptical, as particularly having had a fantastic tour of Rauscham exactly from this point of view. This is where you walk, this is what it means, this is what it's like. And I think, well, how can you see it otherwise? And Rauscham is a wonderful one, because that is William Kent, and it's one of these, as I say, theatrical Arcadias, where it's got all these temples, and it's like a theatrical set, it's really. But you walk through that and you have all these experiences. And one thing that is very intriguing at Rauscham is that when that was built, they added to the house a dining room and a library and a drawing room, rather, in exactly the same positions relative to the garden as the ones at Chopra that Thomas Wright added, as if the library and the drawing room are part of a complete system. So I think that is something where you might never find proof of it, but it seems inescapable, really. You have to look at it from the point of view of stories and imagination, not just as art. One there and then one there.
So, yes, thank you very much for your excellent talk. I couldn't help but notice your reference to Confucius in Anderson's State. I was just wondering, I'm not sure whether this came up in your research, was there any sort of openings from the mid-century Platonists towards other philosophical traditions around the world, or was Confucius just a reference to Anderson's brother's Chinese ventures?
Right. Again, I can't actually prove this, but this is the point that in the what is now the dining room, but is really a drawing room at Chopra, you have the Apollo and the Hours above, and then there are roundels on each of the four walls, and there's Isis and Serapis, and a Maenad with grapes in her hair, and Confucius over the window. And it's only very recently they've even noticed it's Confucius.
Oh.
They're weird, all sorts of crazy things in guidebooks that make no sense. But it isn't simply that it's just an allusion to George Anson travelling to China, because the portrait of Confucius in that roundel is taken from a 17th century edition of Confucius's works that was in the library at Chopra. And I think it's at Kew, where the Chinese house slightly later was actually called Confucius's house. So the Confucian philosophy was read and thought about in the 18th century in those places. Sorry, there's someone else.
Yeah, thank you. I feel I've been touched a little by Arcadia during your talk. I'm quite interested in the timeline that you were developing from Anson upwards, and I've just forgotten the dates of Thomas Taylor.
When was he born? Anyone remember Thomas Taylor's date of birth? 1770-ish? His books were published from about 1790 onwards, when he was quite young. And Sydenham died in 1787, so a very young Thomas Taylor knew a very elderly Sydenham. Thomas Anson died in 1773, and his gardens were developed between the 1740s and the 1770s. Well, I think that's covered everything I thought people might ask questions. Have we run out of time?
I was just going to.
Because I will say, I'm going to just say one other thing. And another area of discussion is the importance of music. And you can't go far without having musical influences. And one thing I think that is not really thought about is that when you think about the 18th century and the lack of interest in Greek mythology, Plato, etc., etc., and there really wasn't support. Someone like Dr. Johnson really, really didn't like James Harris. There are people who really objected to it. They thought it was escapist fantasy and all that kind of thing. But at the same time, they were going to the opera, which had lots of mythology. It had lots of actual magic. They were looking at all these fantastic landscapes as theatrical sets, and people don't seem to notice this. And the big question is, to what extent is there actually serious philosophy in all that? And one thing that I think is, to me, I would stand up and say is true, is Handel. You can't say Handel ever says anything to imply he's a Platonist. But at the time James Harris is writing his 3 treatises, Handel spends some time at Harris's house in Salisbury, and immediately afterwards goes and writes his setting of Milton, the Allegro and Penseroso, based on the Milton poem, which is suggested by Harris and planned by Harris, and he writes a whole series of things that are all about the power of music. And you can't really escape the fact that this must be influenced by these philosophical talks about music and philosophy. And a critical thing, I think, a little tiny thing, which I think is significant, is that in Harris's book in 1741, he writes about music, thinking about opera, as having the power to create affects or feelings in which we can absorb the meaning of words, as if the music is secondary to the words. And that's really an idea that's going out of fashion. Handel goes and disproves it by writing instrumental music, which has meaning in itself. But Sydenham, 30 years later, has a quote where he talks about language having the power, like Handel's music, to raise ideas in the soul. And I think that's a complete sudden... It's only then people sing music as a language in itself, which is, they didn't have the words, but they were doing it and listening to it all the time.
That's wonderful, Andrew. And I just mentioned one of our Temenos fellows is Jocelyn Godwin, who's written extraordinarily about the origins and evolution of opera and its connection with the mysteries.
Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you. And before we finally thank you, I just want to mention that I think it's next Monday we have another Temenos lecture, again here, on Winter Flowers, the life and art of Lorna Graves. I'm sure you've all got one of these, but I just wanted to remind you of that. So, Andrew, that was quite magnificent.
Thank you, Julia.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Gemma.